Hello crafty friends, welcome to another card making video. Today I'm going to take inspiration from one of my journals. This is my kind of ephemera collecting, idea gathering, slap it all down kind of journal. And this is the title page I made for the month of September. And I really enjoyed making it, so I thought I would try and transfer some of this onto the front of a card. So I'm taking inspiration for a card from one of my journals. So the first thing I did was take a very light pink brush pen and make some brush strokes in a diagonal from the top to the bottom of a piece of mixed media paper. My journal is made of very thin square grid paper, and I did think about sticking that down onto another piece of card and using that, but these pens work really nicely on mixed media paper, so I thought I would use that instead. It's a lot more robust than the paper on the notebook, so I thought it would stand up well to being on the front of a card. Next, I deviated from the journal page slightly and spattered some water onto the marker pen. This is a water-based marker, so you can lift the colour off with water in a similar way to inks like distress inks and distress oxides. Before moving on, I picked up the water with a paper towel and dried it, and then I brought in the same stencil I used in my notebook and the same ink, worn lipstick distress oxide, and added 3 patches of stenciling. So the blue and white striped bit of paper that I had on my notebook page came from a sweetie bag. I think we picked it up on holiday a couple of years ago, and it's been sitting in my ephemera stash since then. But the sweetie bag reminded me of a set of stamps that I've got from Skull and Crossbuns with sweets on. So instead of adding planner type stamps, the ones I added to my journal page, I decided to make this a sweet theme card and add the sweet stamps instead. So I put 3 of the large circle sweet stamps on a block in a triangle, inked them up with black soot distress oxide, because that's what I used on my journal page, and stamped them in a cascade down the front of the card. I then added a sprinkling of smaller circular stamps from the stamp set. On my journal page, after I'd done my stamping, I splattered on some gold metallic paint. For my card, I chose a copper colour because on my journal page, the gold didn't stand out very much, so I thought I'd go for a darker metallic. And then I gave the whole thing a really good dry with my hairdryer and ran it through my die cutting machine with a large stitched rectangle die. I wanted to mount this on a card, but when I put it against the card, the slight creaminess of the background jarred with the bright whiteness of the card blank, so I thought I would get around that by adding some worn lipstick, distress oxide, to the edges of the front of my card and sticking my panel on that so it had a pink border rather than a white border, and that worked really well. Next, it was time to work on my focal spot, so I took a piece of that blue and white sweetie bag and tore it into a small enough piece to fit on my card front. I didn't want it too big, I didn't want it to cover up too much of my stamping and stenciling, but I didn't want it too small either. It needed to stand out really. So here you can see how it's shaping up compared to the journal page. Next, I wanted to find a bit of paper that was that kind of deep maroon colour with some gold embossing on it. I didn't have anything else in my stash. That little square was one I bought back from Japan and I only had one of it. So I used some aged mahogany distress oxide to colour a piece of mixed media paper. I used the re-inker and a finger dauber because I haven't got an ink pad for this colour. To pink it up a bit, I used worn lipstick and I rubbed the ink pad over the aged mahogany. That did mucky up my ink pad a little bit, but I cleaned it up by rubbing it onto another piece of paper, which will go in my box of backgrounds and bits. So I gave my pinky maroon paper a really good dry. I dusted it with some talcum powder and then dipped it into embossing powder to see if it was still wet. It needed a little bit more of a dry, so I dried it with my hairdryer again, talcum powdered it again, and then I took a stamp which had a really delicate, pretty pattern on it, inked it up with embossing ink and pressed my aged mahogany paper down onto the inked stamp. I then dipped it in the gold embossing powder, heated it with my heat tool, and I got exactly what I wanted. A lovely gold embossed pattern on that kind of pinky maroon colour. I trimmed that down to the appropriate size with my guillotine, used high-tack white glue to add the sweetie bag on top, and then high-tack white glue to add the whole thing to the front of my card in a similar position to where it was on my journal page. Next, it was time to stamp my sentiment, and I chose "You're Super Sweet," which was a sentiment that came in the same stamp set as the stamps I used earlier. I stamped that onto some more mixed media paper so it was the same creaminess as the paper that I created the background on. Chopped it down with my scissors in a kind of jaunty way. I didn't want it to be too neat and tidy. That's not the vibe I'm going for. And I added that on the focal point where I had September 2025 on my journal page. And for a finishing touch, instead of adding a load of stickers, which I did on my journal page, I decided to create 3 sweetie images to add around my sentiment. I stamped a cola bottle and coloured this in with brown and yellow marker pen. I stamped a gummy bear and coloured that yellow. Initially, I stamped it and coloured it yellow, but it ended up looking a bit mucky. The black ink probably wasn't quite dry enough. So to get around this, I coloured a piece of card yellow and then stamped the gummy bear on top. I cut these out with my scissors and then went around the edge with a black Sharpie just to neaten up the edges and cover up any fussy cutting mistakes I might have made. The other sweetie image that I stamped and coloured was a fried egg. I glued these with high-tack white glue around my sentiment, and then I took some Nouveau Crystal Glaze, which is similar to Glossy Accents, and covered all 3 images with the glaze to make them nice and shiny, because sweets generally have that kind of shiny look, and I thought it would help them stand out on the card. So here is the finished card. Love the way it turned out. I think it's a lot of fun. And I really enjoyed taking inspiration from my journal page. I'd love to know if you've ever done anything like this. Have you created something and then thought, I'd love to try that on a card or other paper craft project? Do let me know in the comments. Right, I hope you've enjoyed the video and I hope you'll join me for another one very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.